Thank you, guys. All right. So, over the past 2 weeks, we've been looking at some of Christian history's most fascinating figures in our Giants of Church History Volume 2 series. First, we looked at Bernard of Clairvaux, and last week we got a 2-for-1 with Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. And we looked at Bernard of Clairvaux's 4 stages of love, found in his great work On Loving God. And then last week we saw how Teresa and John worked for reformation in the Spanish church, as well as in the hearts of Christians everywhere who seek to know God more deeply. We looked at Teresa of Avila's Interior Castle and John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul, and those are 2 of the great masterworks of spiritual mysticism, pointing the way towards a deep union with God. Tonight we're going to focus shift our focus pretty dramatically from the 1500s to the late 1700s, early 1800s in the United States of America. We're going to look at the life of a man by the name of Richard Allen. He was a preacher, social worker, and Methodist bishop living in Philadelphia in the early days of American independence. Now, on the surface, there's not a lot that makes Richard Allen stand out from many of his contemporaries. He traveled around early America preaching, but there were a lot of itinerant preachers in early America in those days. He founded an organization to help the sick take care of themselves, or not to have them take care of themselves, to take care of the sick and those in need. But he was not the only person who did that. There were a lot of people setting up organizations to help fill in the gap where the government or others could not take care of people. He worked his way up the Methodist Conference to become a deacon, an elder, and eventually even a bishop. But again, many other people have held high office in the church. So what sets Richard Allen apart is that he did all of this in the late 1700s and early 1800s as a black man, a former slave whose passionate preaching and convictions led him to stand up for the equality of all people before God. Richard Allen was born in 1760 in Pennsylvania as a slave. In his early years, he was sold along with his siblings and his mother to a farmer in Delaware. But then that farmer had financial problems and sold off several of Allen's siblings, as well as his mother, to someone else. And so Allen was left with an older brother and sister to take care of him. And in the 1770s, these 3 siblings began to attend meetings at the local Methodist Society gathering. Now, the Methodists are a pretty new group at this time. They were founded by a guy named John Wesley, who, as I've said for every week so far, is somebody that we're going to reference who deserves his own one of these Giants of Church History series. But he and his brother Charles and some others founded this Methodist society, which in the beginning was not a church per se. It didn't break off from a church denomination, but it was a separate meeting where people would go, and it was kind of like a really intense Bible study that featured you need to confess all of your sins to everybody, and then people would help you work on them. But there's also Bible study, and there was an expectation that you'd go out and you'd give to the poor, and you'd preach and teach. So Methodism was this kind of new thing, and it was still catching on in England, but it kind of, even before it really took off in England, it was starting to grow in America, thanks to a guy named Francis Asbury, who we'll meet in a moment. So, the other thing about the Methodist meetings is they're one of the few places in the Christian church in America that allowed black people to come in and participate. They welcome people, free or slave. And so at age 17, Richard Allen and his siblings were converted to the Methodist way, and they began to evangelize others. He preached on his plantation and at various Methodist meetings around in Delaware, where his owner would allow him to attend. He was a natural preacher. He loved it so much that he jumped at every opportunity to preach. He was constantly doing that. Richard Allen wrote of that time, and he said, "Sometimes I would wake from my sleep, preaching and praying." So his master is warned by other slave owners that Allen's preaching is going to lead him to be unproductive and not a good slave. But Richard and his brother worked doubly hard to make sure that their owner would let them keep preaching the gospel. And eventually, Richard even managed to convert his owner, who learned that Methodists opposed slavery. Now, in what's going to become a recurring theme of this sermon, his owner learns the lesson about halfway. He kind of gets it. Rather than freeing his slaves, he allows them to purchase their own freedom if they're able to. And so Allen and his siblings just keep working extra hard, and eventually in 1780, so at about 20 years old, Richard was able to buy his own freedom. And beginning in 1781, he traveled around Delaware on the preaching circuit with Methodists, attracting crowds wherever he went. He would travel and preach until he ran out of money, and then he would just kind of stop and do manual labor until he earned enough money to keep going and keep preaching. But that pattern didn't last very long, because it wasn't too long before a guy named Francis Asbury, who, as I've already mentioned, was sort of responsible for the explosion of Methodism in America. He was a little bit older, and he was a traveling preacher as well, and he meets Richard Allen and hears him preach, and basically makes sure that he never goes without a place to preach for as long as he wants to. So he kind of gives him places to preach everywhere, helps him out. So he does this for about 5 years, and then in 1786, Richard Allen returned to Philadelphia, the place where he was originally born, and he began to attend St. George's Methodist Church, and he would lead prayer services there. So he became a leader at this church. And that quickly attracted many free blacks to St. George's. Now, up to that point, St. George's Methodist Church had no history of segregated worship. People could sit wherever they liked, they worshiped together. But things were about to change. At that time, about 10% of Methodists in America were black people, a fairly sizable portion for any church in America, especially at that time. But in most places, even though black and white people often worshiped in the same place, black Methodists really didn't enjoy much actual equality or freedom. In a lot of Methodist churches, there were segregated sections for them to sit in. They couldn't mingle among the white people during the prayer meetings. But St. George's Church had never been like that. And it's possible that the reason was just that there hadn't been that many black people before. But now that there were, now that Allen was there and preaching, and the black population at this church was growing, tensions began to grow. And soon the white leaders at the church made it a requirement that black parishioners use the chairs set up around the walls, rather than sit in any of the pews. And so once again, we kind of see this recurring pattern that Allen is dealing with people who had only half learned the lesson. Methodists they were opposed to slavery, right? That was an official position. They believed that everyone was equal before God. And yet here they were in a place that had never had segregation before. Now that they had to deal with it in person, they were choosing segregation. And so even having someone prominent like Richard Allen and seeing what he was able to do, they still sort of lived with that inbred feeling of superiority or inferiority for others, and the need to keep people separate. So they don't seem to really have learned all the way their lesson. Now this pretty much immediately led to an incident, because in 1787, so barely a year since Richard Allen had arrived in Philadelphia, and not very long after implementing this new policy, some of the black parishioners sat in some of the pews that they didn't know were reserved for whites. Among this group of black worshipers was Allen's friend and associate, Absalom Jones. And Jones and others knelt in prayer during the prayer service. One of the white trustees of the church came up to them, and he grabbed Absalom Jones and started to pull him up, saying, "You must get up. You must not kneel here." And Jones calmly asked him to please wait till the prayer service was over, and then we could talk about this. But the trustee responded, "No, you must get up now, or I will call for aid and force you away." Despite this, Jones and the others remained where they were, finished their prayers, and then got up and walked out of the church as a group. And Jones immediately went to Richard Allen and told him about this. Now, Allen had been considering whether to establish his own independent Methodist congregation for black people, and the travesty at St. George's pushed him over the edge. He had no desire to leave the Methodist Conference, the Methodist Church, but he wanted a place where black people could worship in freedom. And so Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, because they faced this significant resistance from white leaders who began to threaten them with expulsion from the Methodist Conference if they went ahead with their plan, yet by 1794, they were able to buy an old blacksmith shop and turn it into their new church, which they called the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. Francis Asbury, same guy we've met a few times, he dedicated the new church, tried to give it a legitimate place among the Methodist Conference. But for the next 15 years, white Methodist leaders in Pennsylvania continued to fight Richard Allen, claiming that they actually had jurisdiction over his church until 1816, when the Pennsylvania Supreme Court finally ruled that the church belonged to Allen, Jones, and their associates. Now, during this period of struggle with the white Methodist leaders, right before Richard Allen was able to buy his church building, in 1793, there was a yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia. And one of Allen's earliest actions after leaving St. George's Methodist Church, so a few years prior to the yellow fever outbreak, had been to start what he called the Free African Society, which was a non-denominational association intended to help runaway slaves, as well as free blacks who moved to Philadelphia, as well as helping take care of the sick and the poor in their city. Now, in the midst of this yellow fever outbreak in 1793, those same white leaders who are still fighting against Richard Allen's ownership of his own church came to him and they asked the Free African Society to help serve as nurses and to bury the dead. Now, Allen and Jones recognized the inherent racism in this request, that these white men wanted the black people to do the dirty work, to expose themselves to the risk of yellow fever, take care of sick white people. But they were never going to give those same black people who they are asking for help any kind of equality as soon as the sickness was gone. But rather than sending them away or cursing them out, which is something I probably would have done in that situation, what they decided to do is to help. They agreed to help completely, partly from compassion, which they talked about learning from Jesus, but also as just one more way to demonstrate the moral and spiritual equality of black people. Now, while all of this is going on, the yellow fever epidemic, them buying their own church, fighting the white leaders to own their own church, other black Christian leaders in early America took inspiration from what Allen was doing. And they formed churches and asked to join Allen's movement. And thus, in April 1816, the African Methodist Episcopal Church denomination, with Richard Allen as its leader, was formed. And so Allen was the first black person to be consecrated as a bishop in America. He served as the spiritual and moral leader of this new denomination for the rest of his life, until he died in 1831. Richard Allen's story is a story of perseverance for the gospel. After his conversion, he never quit working for his vision of a Christian church that embraced racial equality, despite a lot of obstacles. Time and again, the white people around Allen seemed to, at best, halfway learn the lesson that they were supposed to see, that everyone was equal in the eyes of God. His master deciding that slavery is wrong, but rather than freeing his slaves, just letting them buy their freedom. The white people of St. George's Methodist Church, who said that black people were equal but couldn't handle sitting next to them in their pews. Methodist leaders who said they wanted to help Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, and yet they fought them for 15, 20 years to keep them under the white Methodist thumbs. But in spite of all of that, Allen tirelessly championed his congregation and fought to be respected. He established a church and an organization to help not only other free black people like himself, but those running away from slavery. And he was part of the Underground Railroad as well, which is just sort of a thing to throw. Sometimes that would be like somebody's greatest achievement in life, but that's just sort of a throwaway part of, yeah, he was also helping runaway slaves. It's part of the Underground Railroad. I have two lessons for us tonight from the life of Richard Allen. The first is that we need to keep our eyes open, searching our hearts for the places where we might only be learning the lesson halfway. We live in a very complex and connected world where many people who have been silenced or who have been ignored are speaking up. They're demanding that their identities and their histories be recognized. So are we learning the lesson, or are we clinging to old ways? There are people all around us who've been hurt by other people, but especially by the church. And not only by those who have been hurt by obviously hypocritical church leaders or people who abuse their power, but even well-meaning Christians who just didn't know how to say the right words, or didn't know how to deliver their message the right way. Everyone makes mistakes, but are we learning? Are we learning the lessons of the gospel? That love is the most important thing? Have we learned how to put others before ourselves, to admit our mistakes and our sins? It's our responsibility to not be like those Methodist leaders who couldn't really seem to learn the lesson that they claim to have learned. The second lesson I have for us is that, like Richard Allen himself, we should be persistent and persevere in our efforts for the gospel. We're not likely to face nearly the same number of obstacles in our efforts to preach the gospel as Richard Allen did. Nor are we likely to face nearly as much opposition from people who say they're here to help us. But Allen faced all that, and he kept on preaching, kept on organizing, kept on helping those in need, kept on leading his congregation. He was compassionate towards the very same people who were trying to keep him down, even towards his own slave master. No matter the circumstance or the obstacle, Richard Allen pursued God and preached the gospel at all times. So like Allen, let us persevere and keep fighting for the good news of the gospel, that all people are equal in the sight of God. Now let's spend some time gathered in prayer.